everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Also consider joining my Patreon page for some cool perks. I'll leave a link in the description. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Rock and Read. Today you will get to hear Chapter 6 of Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. Chapter 6 is called UK Tour. Here we go. What is it they say about sports? It doesn't build character, it reveals character. The same is true of life on the road. How you treat your co-workers and friends when you're stuck on an aging commercial bus for a month with a persistent and thundering headache, born of equal parts carbon monoxide, sleep deprivation, food, and overindulgence in chemical substances says a lot about the person you are. After our delightful and first-class vacation in Paris, we headed out on the next leg of our tour, a grueling journey through the United Kingdom, in which the band played a breathtaking 25 shows in 30 days. It would have been 26 if not for the fact that one date was canceled. By any measurable standard, this was an incredibly ambitious schedule, even for a band composed of 4 hungry and healthy young men. Even more remarkable, on every one of those dates we opened for Black Sabbath, heavy metal legends from the UK who were more than a decade into their careers and clearly starting to feel the ravages of time from both a creative and a psychological standpoint. But while we suffered through 4 weeks on a commercial sit-up bus, the hard-partying gents of Black Sabbath, who were closer to middle age than they were to adolescence, traveled in relative luxury with a tricked-out tour bus befitting their status as rock icons. I worried from the first day of this tour that an outburst or confrontation was inevitable. You can't live in such close proximity to the same group of people for this length of time, day after day, without tensions boiling over in response to injustices both real and perceived, major or seemingly insignificant. And I kept a wary eye on Edward. If the kid was capable of being incapacitated by homesickness while staring out the window of a luxury hotel suite in Paris, what would become of his fragile psyche on a 4-week bus tour of the UK? I don't mean to be facetious. It was a legitimate concern. Touring on a bus with all the amenities of home, including wives and girlfriends, as Van Halen did in later years, is one thing. Bouncing around the countryside on a commercial vehicle with wheezy shocks and a poor ventilation system is another matter entirely. Surprisingly, though, Edward took to it just fine, as did Alex and Michael. I realized on this leg of the tour that Eddie was basically like a kid at summer camp. The best way for him to avoid homesickness and depression was to stay as busy as possible. If we could get him on stage every night, he was just fine. It was the downtime he hated. 3 days in Paris without a gig left too much time for pondering the meaning of life. The formula for keeping Edward happy in those early days was simple: a lot of weed and alcohol and as many concerts as possible. Edward may not have wanted to be a rock star, but he loved playing guitar. The schedule in the UK tour took care of that aspect of things. When you're playing a different show every night, there isn't time to get depressed. But the other accoutrements that typically came with being in a popular band were harder to come by. Consider, for example, that Van Halen from the outset was a band that appealed to both male and female, and our audience reflected that popularity. Lots of wannabe head-banging teenage boys and plenty of nubile young ladies just dying for a chance to meet one of the guys in the band. When we toured in the States and in most places internationally, there was never a shortage of female companionship. In the UK, while supporting Black Sabbath, the demographic was quite different indeed. I don't know the exact numbers, but when I looked out into the crowd every night, it seemed like 98% of the audience was young and not so young men, and they were all dressed in black jeans and t-shirts, black leather jackets, lots of piercings and tattoos, a hardcore metal crowd. Nothing wrong with that. The fans in the UK warmed quickly to Van Halen, and the guys in Black Sabbath even made jokes about how we were kicking their ass on a nightly basis. But the lack of easy sex presented a sudden and disheartening change of pace for a group of boys who had come to see these dalliances as part of the job, the best part. Compounding their frustration was a distinct downturn in both the quality and quantity of drugs available. Van Halen thrived on weed and alcohol in those days, weed especially. Marijuana was not so easily procured in the UK, so we settled for a mixture of hash and tobacco. The guys in Black Sabbath were working-class Brits and had been rolling their own cigarettes for years, so it was no big deal to them. The four guys from Southern California who had been smoking for years probably had no idea what was even inside a cigarette. They tried to learn, but usually wound up with something that looked like an understuffed joint. More often, they would try to insert hash into their pre-rolled American cigarettes, but the cigarette would either break apart or there wasn't enough hash to provide much of a buzz. Sometimes they would stuff the hash into an empty can, drill a hole in the bottom, set it ablaze, and try to get high by inhaling the fumes of the makeshift bong. Didn't work very well. The stuff tasted like and simply didn't get the job done. That's about as bad a combination as you can get. So without sex, drugs, and the luxuries of the American road, the boys often were in a truly foul mood, especially David. While the others were merely aggravated and annoyed, David took this entire scenario as a personal affront, as if the paucity of drugs and women was a response by the British government to the arrival of David Lee Roth, a conspiracy of sorts to deprive the star of the very lifeblood of stardom. David's response, and this would get worse as the years went on, was to take out his anger and frustration on those closest to him. We were maybe a week into the UK tour when David began calling daily mandatory band meetings. Ostensibly post-mortems on the previous night's show, they were actually just an excuse to rant and rave, to publicly pick at whatever bug had somehow managed to penetrate the layers of spandex and leather and take residence in David's ass. We'd gather in the middle of the bus, a dozen members of the band and crew, and subject ourselves to David's wandering, unfocused harangue about the myriad ways in which we had up the most recent performance. With venom and spite, David would complain about anything and everything, from sound to lights to every stage move and vocal or instrumental mishap he could think of. The tongue lashing was of indeterminate duration. If he was too tired to work up much of a lather, it might only last 15 minutes. If he was particularly agitated, it might go on for the better part of an hour while we all sat stone-faced and bored. These sessions never escalated into serious confrontations. Not on this tour, anyway. In fact, they rarely even resulted in any sort of serious dialogue about ways in which the product might be improved. Rather, they were an exercise in egoism by David, indulged by his bandmates and subordinates simply because it was the path of least resistance. Bully that he could be, David chose his targets carefully, seeming to direct most of his bile at those who were least capable of fighting back, or the least likely to fight back anyway. Swipes at his bandmates were made in vague terms, except in the case of Michael, whose musicianship and backing vocals were sometimes called into question. Ridiculous, because of course Michael's backing vocals did nothing but enhance David's singing, especially when they played live. In the studio, you can hide a singer's weakness with multiple takes and sonic tricks. This was true even in the days before auto-tune. But on stage, every singer is mostly naked, and the easiest way to cover up the oral blemishes is with a really capable background singer, or two. In Van Halen, that singer was Michael. Unfortunately, a gentle and laid-back demeanor also made him an easy target for David. There was no threat of Michael returning the volley. Instead, he would just sit there and quietly absorb the abuse. Sometimes David would even go so far as to blame the drought in his sex life on mistakes made by others in the band or crew. Performance, he reasoned, naturally turned off fans and diverted them from his dressing room. This was complete rubbish. Van Halen put on a series of stellar shows on this tour, night after unrelenting night, but if only a small percentage of the audience is female, then backstage groupie traffic is going to be light. That's just the way it works. David was simply suffering the pangs of withdrawal. Not enough sex, not enough drugs, and the effect was unflattering to say the least. It should be pointed out that he said very little regarding my performance. I do not believe it was because of any obvious difference between my abilities and those of the rest of the entourage, although it's true that I did not often screw up, but simply because David was uncertain of how much clout I had with Warner Brothers. As tour manager, I existed in a foggy realm somewhere between band employee and front office executive. I served two masters and tried to please both equally. But it didn't hurt that both sides were a bit confused about where my allegiance stood or how much influence I had with either camp. Even better if it kept David off my back. Nevertheless, he made many days a living hell for everyone. The worst of those followed a morning disclosure that Rudy, the guitar tech turned announcer, had gotten laid the previous night. Now you have to understand that in matters of sex, roadies occasionally benefit from their proximity to rock stars. It's not an everyday occurrence the way it is for the guys in the band, and it sure is. Wasn't commonplace during that month-long tour of the UK. But Rudy apparently had found a companion for the night, and his divulging that news led to spontaneous bursts of applause on the bus. People stood and cheered and patted Rudy on the back for his good fortune. This, after all, was a time for magnanimity. Who could begrudge the guitar tech for getting laid? Surely not Edward, his best friend from high school and now his de facto boss. Eddie just smiled and nodded. So did Alex and Michael. We were all happy that somehow in this most arid of conjugal climates, where even the biggest swingers on the bus were striking out, Rudy had broken the slump. Well, almost everyone. David said nothing, merely scowled and fidgeted angrily in his seat. Imagine the injustice of it all, the guitar tech getting laid while the lead singer, a veritable pheromone factory, goes home with Rosie Palmer. For most of us, this was cause for celebration, and Rudy downed many a beer later that night without ever touching his wallet. For David, well, not so much apparently. What happened next was the result of a misguided attempt on my part to lighten the mood by playing a little joke on David. I might as well admit that I should have anticipated the consequences. Even then, in those early days, before he felt the full bloom of stardom and power, David was not particularly good at self-deprecation. He took himself rather seriously, which meant you poked fun at him at your own peril. That afternoon we had lunch at a typically nondescript little English road shop on the M1, heading out of the Midlands. We all sat together at a long, heavy wooden table and tried to stuff our faces with English brunch fare, steak and eggs, greasy hash browns and chips, and hamburgers charred to a carcinogenic black, regardless of how you might have ordered them. Thanks largely to Rudy's good fortune, the mood was considerably lighter than it had been in the previous few days. We ate and laughed and told stories, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Everyone except David, who sat sullenly in his chair, poking at his food and generally behaving like the death of the party. After a while, David excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving behind a plate overflowing with a nest of chips and two large, virtually untouched hamburgers. For some reason that I still can't explain, although annoyance was probably at the root of it, I was gripped by a sudden urge to take a huge bite out of one of the burgers. Even as I swallowed it, I knew that this was probably a mistake and would be met with the benign response I had intended. A few of the guys at the table saw me take the bite out of David's food, but no one said anything, and no one laughed. A couple of them looked at me like I was crazy, and then simply continued with their meal. A couple minutes later, David emerged from the bathroom and sauntered back to the table. He pulled out his chair, sat down, threw back his hair, and then his face went ashen. There was a long pause before he spoke, during which he took a hard look around the table. Finally, he picked up the plate, gave it a half spin in his hand, and then slammed it back down, sending chips and hamburger juice in all directions. A silence came over the entire restaurant as David stood up, looking like he was about to give an angry toast. "I don't know which one of you stupid heads did this," he said, pointing at the plate still wobbling on the table, "but you can finish it." And with that, he marched out of the restaurant. After a few moments of awkward silence, we all resumed eating and telling stories, leaving David to cool off on his own. I realized pretty quickly that I had overstepped my bounds. A joke to one person is an act of aggression to another. I certainly hadn't meant to upset David to quite this extent, though I did think he was behaving petulantly and deserved to have his ego tweaked. This was my dance with David throughout our time together. I appreciated and respected his talent and ambition, but found his personality at best challenging, and at worst sociopathic. Moreover, David had been getting on my nerves to a greater extent than usual, in part because we spent so much time together. By the time we began touring the UK, David had taken to changing his wardrobe multiple times during the course of a show, and sometimes it was among my many duties to man the quick change booth just off the stage. The booth was really just a makeshift closet space, usually fashioned out of curtains or drapes, in which David could rush off stage between songs or during a guitar solo and change from black leather to brown leather, or from leather to spandex, or whatever. But since these changes were indeed quick, he needed some assistance, so I would literally wait by the edge of the stage, and when David came running off, I would join him in the quick change booth and help peel off his sweat-soaked pants or shirt. It was not a job that I cherished, and not simply because of the obvious grossness of the act, but because David was usually in such a frenzy that working with him in this environment was like trying to collar a pit bull in a phone booth. Bruises were inevitable. "Let's go! Hurry the... I'll go out there naked, I swear to..." Easy, David. Easy does it. The inherent narcissism of becoming a rock star would with anyone's head, but David was well down the path before he even joined Van Halen. He had always been, as they say, a legend in his own mind, and when legitimate stardom and success came his way, he devoured it like a drug. Increasingly, I would notice David posing at every opportunity, not just in the dressing room before going on stage, but every time he passed a mirror window, I'd catch him pausing and vamping, tossing his hair and sucking in his cheeks like a model. He was obsessed with his appearance. Nevertheless, I felt bad about what I had done in the restaurant and the apparent distress it had caused him. What I disliked most about David was his tendency to bully and manipulate, and my little joke, while harmless, exhibited exactly some of those same traits. I considered it nothing more than giving David a tiny dose of his own medicine, but he obviously felt otherwise. So to make amends, I ordered a new plate of food as we were nearing the end of our meal, asking the waitress to box it up, and delivered it to David on the bus. He was sitting cross-legged in a front window seat, indulging a mighty sulk. As I stopped in the aisle and tried to make eye contact, he didn't move an inch, and steadfastly avoided my gaze. "David, I'm sorry," I said to the side of his head. "I did not mean to piss you off." This was not entirely true. I did hope to elicit a reaction from David. I just didn't think it would be quite so severe. He didn't budge, gave no indication that he had even heard what I said, although clearly he had. I decided to press on. "I have something for you," I said, holding out the box, which by this time was beginning to show signs of strain, with a large grease blot spreading across the bottom like some sort of industrial spill. "You're probably hungry, so here, please take this." Through inaction, he declined, so I sat down next to him and placed the sagging box between us. I'm not sure exactly how much time passed before the tension thawed. Perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, during which I occasionally tried to make small talk. Eventually, almost out of the blue, David turned to me and smiled. "Oh, it's okay, Noel. I was just fooling around." He paused, reached down, and opened the box. As he withdrew a wilted burger and took a giant bite, he nodded assuredly. "Had you going there, didn't I?" There were a myriad ways to respond to this line of bull. But by now I knew David well enough to understand both his ego and his insecurities. He didn't want to be perceived as small or petty, even though he demonstrably was. He didn't want people to think he was thin-skinned or weak, even though he routinely threw temper tantrums. David was complicated. At heart, he was an entitled rich kid, which informed many of his relationships and behavior. He was accustomed to acting on every impulse, and as his stardom and wealth and drug use accrued, he naturally made less effort to keep his emotions in check. On this day, though, it was clear that he felt somewhat ashamed about having stormed out of the restaurant. I felt bad too, but I wasn't about to get into a heavy discussion about which one of us had been less mature. "Yeah, you sure did, David," I said, slapping him on the back. Then I grabbed one of his chips and stuffed it into my mouth. David laughed. "Help yourself, Noel." Black Sabbath was a pioneering act in the heavy metal genre. They were the real deal, with far less interest in melody and accessibility than Van Halen, and a legitimately dark and depressing outlook on life that was often reflected in their music. I liked the guys in the band, but their lust for drugs and alcohol far exceeded anything the boys in Van Halen had ever known. Sabbath by this time was a famous and wealthy band with the resources to keep themselves awash in chemicals, which they had been doing for years, much to the detriment of the group. This tour was ostensibly a 10th anniversary celebration for Black Sabbath, but they were by now a band on the downslope of a long and steady decline. In late 1977, the band's lead singer and most prominent personality, Ozzy Osbourne, had suddenly quit Black Sabbath as they were about to begin recording a new album. A couple months passed. Ozzy had a change of heart and rejoined the band, and together they recorded the album Never Say Die, which would be met with intense critical disfavor when it was released in September 1978. Our first month-long UK tour with Sabbath occurred as they were putting the finishing touches on that album. A second leg in the States coincided roughly with the album's release. As I said, the two bands and their respective crews got along quite well, although by the end of the second tour, we had become far more adept at drinking and drugging than we had been prior to our introduction to Black Sabbath. And when I say we, I am referring specifically to the four members of the band. I had been around the business a long time and had been exposed to all manners of bad behavior. I knew when to say when, and exercised that privilege more often than not. My job description, after all, was quite different than that of Edward or David. Someone had to be the grown-up, and that someone was me. Most of the time, anyway. While Black Sabbath was the clear headliner on this tour, Van Halen stole the show. They were young and vital and filled with the sort of energy and ambition that had begun to drain from Sabbath. This would be the last tour Ozzy ever performed with Black Sabbath. And sometime afterward, he recalled that it was while watching Van Halen that he realized his band's time had come to an end, or at least his time with the band had come to an end. Van Halen blew us off the stage every night. It was so embarrassing, Ozzy would later explain to the media. They kicked our asses, but it convinced me of two things. My days with Black Sabbath were over, and Van Halen was going to be a very successful band. In reality, Ozzy was fired from Black Sabbath, but I suppose that's really a matter of perspective. You say tomato, I say tomato sort of thing. The point is, Van Halen stole the spotlight from Black Sabbath every night on the tour, winning over even the leather-clad Sabbath diehards in the UK. We beat them at their own game, on their turf, in front of their fans. Believe me when I say this, that sort of upstaging almost never happens. Why this did destroy the rapport between the two bands over the course of the two-leg tour that stretched out into the late fall is something of a mystery. Although declining in stature and beset by drug and alcohol problems, Black Sabbath remained a superstar act, and it must have grated on them to lose their nightly battle of the bands. Meanwhile, Van Halen was utterly fearless and tireless every time they took the stage, and it was fascinating to see the band's confidence grow. They didn't give a that they were playing in front of Black Sabbath diehards, who, trust me, were some of the toughest and most hardcore metal fans in the world. By the time Edward finished his guitar solo in Eruption, he had the crowd in the palm of his hand, and David's swagger grew with each passing show, which occasionally led to acts of outright stupidity. There was the time when David veered from the band's frequent end-of-show celebration, which involved spraying the audience with champagne. Instead of merely uncorking the bottles and dousing the first few rows, David, in his exuberance, decided to toss a pair of nearly full bottles high into the air. They soared above the crowd end over end before plummeting earthward like 2-pound bricks. One landed on the concrete floor and shattered into pieces. The other bottle unfortunately cracked some poor bloke across the skull. There was a bit of commotion in the crowd as the band exited the stage and went to the dressing room, unaware of what had happened. But I knew. I saw it, and I knew we were in for a storm. These were not laid-back SoCal stoners. This was an audience of working-class Brits, many of them in their late 20s and early 30s, grown men who liked to drink and fight, and not necessarily in that order. They were generally docile folks into having a good time at the show. But if you pissed them off, well, they were not easily appeased. Get everyone the out of here, I said as I ran into the dressing room. Still shimmering with the afterglow of another great show, the boys stared at me in disbelief as if to say, "What's the problem?" "Just get on the bus," I said. "Don't ask any questions and don't stop to talk to anyone." Within minutes, the band was outside, and I was embroiled in an ugly negotiation with one very unhappy Black Sabbath fan. Dressed in black with a leather jacket and close-cropped hair, he had a welt the size of a golf ball on his head and had blood flowing down his cheek. By his side were a couple of his mates. They were all drunk and extremely agitated. I quickly went into damage control mode. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. "Wanker threw a bottle at me," the young man cried. "Could have cracked my skull." go! I smiled. Look, he didn't really throw it at you. He threw the bottles into the air, and one of them happened to land on your head. It was not intentional. It was stupid, I agree, but it was not intentional. I paused and leaned in for a moment of conspiratorial conversation. David is not the brightest bulb in the box, if you get my meaning. The kid did not respond, nor did his buddies. Rather, they gave me a look of extreme displeasure. Knowing that they wouldn't be so easily deterred, I fell back on an old reliable tactic. Bribery. If I gave you £1,000, would that make all this go away? I asked. Again, the kid said nothing. He simply seethed in a manner that seemed to say, I'd rather just beat the out of you right now. After a few moments, though, his body language softened. You got that kind of money lying around here? A fair question. The exchange rate in those days was nearly 2 to 1, so my offer was roughly $2,000 American. Not exactly chump change. I nodded. Give me a moment. Just wait right here. I retreated to the dressing room, counted out £1,000 in cash, and folded it into an envelope. Then I drew up a quick disclaimer to ensure that further extortion would not be an issue down the road. Sign this, I said to the kid, presenting the disclaimer. Off, he said. Why should I? Look, I don't mind compensating you for injuries caused by my band's stupidity, but this is a one-time offer. Sign it or no money. The kid scrawled his signature. I handed him the envelope, and we went our separate ways. All's well that ends well, or so I thought, until the bus pulled out of the parking lot and a brick went sailing over the roof. Moments later, a second brick crashed into the side of the bus, narrowly missing a window. What the was that? David yelled. I laughed. Just one of your biggest fans saying goodbye. The two bands got along so well through a serendipitous blend of mutual respect and craftsmanship. I don't think any of the guys in Van Halen held Montrose or Journey in particularly high regard, but they were practically awestruck by Black Sabbath. True, the band had seen better days, and Ozzy was by then a 30-year-old alcoholic and drug addict who could have passed for mid-40s, but none of that matters when you're a legend. The guy was seasoned. He was a road warrior. Whether he was lucid enough to know it or not is another matter entirely. Either way, Sabbath remained an iconic presence whose music had inspired and informed the careers of countless younger artists, Van Halen among them. So to find themselves warming up for their idols, them getting drunk together afterward, and swapping stories, well, that was heady stuff. Even David could be quiet and humble in the presence of Ozzy, like a kid listening to his grandfather tell war stories, despite the fact that Ozzy was only 6 years older than David. He was infinitely more experienced in ways related and unrelated to the music business. And while Edward was a legitimate prodigy, he had enormous respect and admiration for Black Sabbath's virtuoso lead guitarist and founding member, Tony Iommi. It wasn't just talent and originality that separated Tony from his heavy metal and hard rock brethren, it was the backstory. When Tony was 17, he was badly injured in an industrial accident while working at a sheet metal factory. The gruesome injury took the tips of his middle and ring finger on his right hand. Since Tony was a left-handed guitar player, this meant he suffered catastrophic damage to his fretting hand, and it occurred at a time when he was preparing to give up the working-class world for good and embark on a full-time musical career. I suppose a lesser man and a less driven artist might have been discouraged to the point of depression and given up on that dream, but Tony rather famously overcame his disability with the help of prosthetic fingertips and became one of the greatest guitar players of his generation, and a man widely recognized as a pioneer of heavy metal. I've heard stories over the years that Tony was saddened by Edward's brilliance on that first tour. Then he became mired in self-pity and envy like Salieri in the presence of Mozart. Not so. I think he admired Edward and saw in him the same spark of genius and ambition that had fueled his own career a decade earlier. They got along great. And I can still recall the night we were treated to a shortened version of Iommi's inspiring story. We were sitting in our dressing room before a show when Tony came in, and we all started shooting the... He was talking about what it was like early in his career in the pre-Sabbath days, and how important it was to be focused and hungry, and how quickly things could slip away. At some point in the conversation, Tony held up his right hand and removed the prosthetic tips, which were sheathed in leather to reveal a pair of nubs cut down nearly to the first joint. Everyone who followed heavy metal closely knows about Tony's story, but to see the evidence like this was at once sobering and inspiring. I couldn't help but think, if this guy can play the guitar as well as he did with a mangled fret hand, imagine what Edward would one day accomplish. Still, it did provide for moments of dark humor as well as inspiration. One night we left the theater late, well after Black Sabbath had already hit the road. I got a panicked call from Albert, the band's road manager. "No, we have a little problem," he said. "What's that?" "Tony can't find his fingers. He thinks he left them on the dressing room table. Can you check?" So I rooted around the room a bit, and indeed Tony had left behind his prosthetic fingertips. "Yep, got them right here," I said. Albert breathed a sigh of relief. "Great. Can you bring them along? We'll get them tomorrow." "Sure thing," I said. The next day, Tony and his fingertips were reunited, and the show went on as scheduled. Why he didn't have a backup set, I have no idea. Or maybe he did, and this was just a favorite pair. I only know that it was hard not to admire a guy who had overcome such adversity, and I hoped that it would have a positive impact on our band. Unfortunately, the most palpable influence Black Sabbath had on Van Halen had less to do with spirituality or art or ambition than it did with chemical experimentation. Obviously, we were hardly choir boys by the time we began touring the UK in '78, but compared to Black Sabbath, Van Halen were a bunch of rank amateurs. Now, I'm not big on blaming one's poor decisions or bad behavior on anyone else. We are all responsible for the lives we lead and the choices we make, and accountability is the ultimate reckoning. It's quite possible, actually it's quite likely, that Van Halen would have sunk into a muck and mire of hardcore drug abuse and alcoholism without any exposure to the mess that Black Sabbath had become. But it's fair to say that prolonged touring with Sabbath hastened the process by normalizing behavior that was in reality quite extreme, even by rock and roll standards. These guys were heavy drug users. By comparison, Journey and Montrose were lightweights, practically teetotalers. Through much of the '78 tour, even as Van Halen hit platinum status, we were a band with little in the way of financial resources. We didn't have the money to buy a lot of drugs. But Black Sabbath did, and once we began touring together in the States in the summer, a veritable blizzard of cocaine descended upon us. The drinking increased as well because, as any drunk will tell you, alcohol and cocaine complement each other perfectly. It's a potentially deadly mix, but it is effective. For a serious drinker, the beauty of cocaine is that it so effectively extends the party. Alcohol is a depressant and eventually puts its user to sleep. Throw some coke into the mix, though, and suddenly you snap back to life. I was never more than a dabbler with cocaine, but I understand its insidious appeal. The toll this toxic combination takes on the mind and body can be catastrophic, and no more vivid example exists than that of Black Sabbath's deeply damaged frontman Ozzy, a tough streetwise kid with tattoos on his knuckles, a fondness for dripping mascara, and a fantastically creepy wail of a voice. He was the face of a band whose satanic bent terrified middle America, and he played the role well, even though in reality he was kind of a sweetheart. By the time Van Halen began touring with Sabbath, however, it was hard to tell what was real and what was performance for Ozzy. Most of the time, I swear he was too up to know what he was doing, and certainly too much of an addict to be an effective or reliable performer. Our guys liked Ozzy, though, especially David, whose cocaine and alcohol use by his own admission escalated significantly when we were traveling across the states with Black Sabbath. David did a fair amount of partying with Ozzy. Whereas David, like everyone else in our band, was young and healthy enough to withstand the ravages of the road, Ozzy was in free fall. The inevitable crash occurred during a particularly memorable stop in Nashville, Tennessee in November near the end of the tour. We finished our 45-minute set and headed for the dressing room with the crowd typically whipped into a frenzy before Sabbath even took the stage. On this night, however, as the audience stomped its feet and cheered for the impending appearance of the headliners, something went wrong. I was sitting with the band in the dressing room when the promoter walked in. He looked nervous as he gestured for me to join him outside. "No," he said, "we can't find Ozzy." My initial reaction was twofold. First, what do you mean you can't find Ozzy? And second, how is this my problem? But all I could manage was to say, "Excuse me?" The promoter nodded. His eyes were wide, a sure sign of panic. "Yeah, he's not here, and no one knows where he is." Contrary to romantic notions of brotherhood and shared experiences, band members did not always arrive at the venue together, especially in the case of artists of a particularly longevity or bands with a superstar frontman. It wasn't unusual for band members to make their own way from the hotel to the venue, or even from the bus to the dressing room. I figured Ozzy was probably either a little hungover or exercising his right to be a diva, and that he'd arrive momentarily and shamble out on stage. Sadly, that was not the case. "I need a favor from you," the promoter said. "What's that?" I responded warily, knowing that under these circumstances, any favor would involve me or my band doing something unpleasant, if not downright unsafe. "We gotta cancel the show," he said, "and we gotta tell the audience." I nodded. "Yeah, that's gonna be a tough thing." "Tough? They'll kill us." "We'd like your guys to back us up while we make the announcement. That should help soften the blow." This struck me as an unreasonable request, to ask Edward, Alex, or Michael to return to the stage and play behind a promoter, while he informed a few thousand Black Sabbath metalheads that the concert they had paid to see, which had probably been on their calendar for months, was not going to happen. "Why the should we do that?" I said. The promoter shrugged. He looked desperate. "Hey, we're on this together, right? You guys are so good that if they just come out and vamp around a little while we break the bad news." He paused. "I don't know, it just might help." "Yeah," I said, "it might help. Or it might put my guys in front of an angry mob throwing about 900 bottles at their heads. Tell you what, I have to run it by the guys, but I'm sure it won't be a problem." "Thanks, Noel." I walked back into the dressing room and called the band together. "Okay, here's the deal," I began. "Ozzy didn't show up, and the promoter wants us to vamp while he tells the audience that Sabbath isn't going to play." Predictably, this explanation was first met by utter silence and then disbelief. Alex was the first to speak. "What, is he out of his mind? The crowd will kill us." "Exactly," I said, "so let's pack up and get the out of here. I told him I'd run it by you just to get him off my back, but I'm not putting you guys at risk." So we packed up really quickly, jumped in the limo, and went back to the hotel, leaving the promoter to fend for himself. And indeed, the crowd responded precisely as we had anticipated, by howling and tossing all manner of garbage onto the stage. For us, avoiding the scene rather than fanning the flame of disappointment was unquestionably the right call. The topic of conversation naturally was, "Where the is Ozzy?" There was talk of getting the police involved and of investigating the possibility that Ozzy had been kidnapped or otherwise waylaid through interaction with nefarious types. I did not believe this for a moment. We knew that Ozzy, like the rest of the band and our band, had made it to the hotel early that morning. For some reason, though, he did not answer his wake-up call in the afternoon. When the road manager checked his room, there was no sign of Ozzy, so it was natural that people would be worried given his sorry condition in those days. I just figured that Ozzy had wandered into a conference room or something and fallen asleep, but it turned out to be a much better story than that. What I did not know at the time was that David and Ozzy had not merely been hanging out and partying together, but had engaged over the previous few days in something they referred to as the Krell Wars. This was basically a non-stop party with breaks only for performances, since we were playing practically every night, with a heavy emphasis on cocaine use. The previous night, Ozzy and David had stayed up all night, burying themselves like Tony Montana in mountains of coke. The party, David said, went on until 9 o'clock in the morning, when our caravan left for Nashville. Keys were distributed upon check-in, and everyone grabbed a nap before wake-up calls were issued, and the bands were summoned to the arena for sound check. David was hungover, but bounced back quite quickly in those days. Ozzy? Not so much. It turned out that he had neglected to look at the room number of his key, and instead dredged up from his barely conscious mind the number of the room he had stayed in the night before when we were in Memphis. Or perhaps the previous night's key was in his pocket. I heard conflicting reports. Regardless, through fate or dumb luck, Ozzy wound up on the wrong floor, wobbling toward the wrong hotel room, in a hotel that no doubt looked exactly like the one he had stayed in the previous night. When he arrived, as luck would have it, the door was open, and a maid was busily completing the task of cleaning the room. Ozzy politely excused the housekeeper and said he wanted to take a nap. She wasn't about to ask for evidence that he was indeed the proper tenant. Ozzy cut far too intimidating a figure for that, even when he was faced, or maybe especially when he was faced. He closed the door, fell onto the bed, and passed out for roughly the next 20 hours. Ozzy finally emerged from an elevator the next morning, wondering what had happened and why no one had bothered to wake him up. In the world of Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne, this constituted a happy ending, But there were unfortunately some loose ends that required tying. You see, it's not a small deal when a headlining band cancels a gig, especially for reasons that can charitably be called negligent. If the lead singer trips over a cable on stage and breaks his ankle during the sound check, necessitating the cancellation of a show, then the band is not responsible for covering the cost of the show. But if a show is canceled because one of the band members did something stupid and entirely preventable, like getting in a fight or sleeping off a 3-day coke jag, then there is a liability issue to address. The promoter of the Nashville show had two choices: offer refunds to everyone who had left the Nashville Municipal Auditorium feeling understandably cheated, or reschedule the concert for a later date. That wasn't really our problem. Van Halen had held up its end of the deal by playing its customary set, per the terms of our contract. But we were walked into a tour as a supporting act for Black Sabbath, and if they wanted to reschedule the gig, then protocol dictated that we behave like good soldiers. We were off that night, November 17th, but had another show scheduled in Midland, Texas the following night. When we arrived in Texas that evening, I got a call from Mark Forster, Black Sabbath's tour director and Albert's assistant. "No, listen, I know you're not the manager, but you're a Warner Brothers person. You have some pull here, and we need a favor." "What's that?" "Well, we rebooked the Nashville date on the one day off we had." He paused. "The 19th. Day after tomorrow?" I said. "That's just great. I'm sure my band will love it." "I'm sorry, Noel. We had no choice. We have to make up the show, and we need your guys on the bill. So here's my problem. If I call Marshall Burla, I know he's going to try to me over. He'll want $2,000 or $3,000. I laughed. "Yeah, that's probably true. We can't do that. It's not in the budget. I need to know if you'll do it for the usual fee." The usual fee, as previously noted, was $750. By this point, it was almost a joke. After agents' fees and managers' fees, the guys in Van Halen were taking home roughly $100 per gig, and yet here they were, a platinum-selling band. But that was the deal, and we accepted it without complaint. Who would have guessed that while we were out on the road, the band would break in spectacular fashion? Sure, I could have asked for more money to make up for the Nashville gig, but Sabbath had been good for our careers, and we had mostly a great time on the tour. I was not adverse to playing hardball once in a while, but on this occasion, taking one for the team seemed like the right thing to do. Besides, I liked the fact that they were coming to me instead of Marshall, so I agreed to the $750, and the guys in the band, while unhappy about losing a night of rest, played their asses off once again for the fans in Nashville. A few days later, Marshall called to ask about the negotiation. "No, we could have gotten a lot more money for that show." "Oh, really?" I replied. "That's too bad, Marshall. I didn't realize." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I imagine Marshall wanted to tell me I was an hold order off, but he didn't. He said absolutely nothing. Marshall didn't know it at the time, or maybe he did, and that's why he chose his words carefully, but his days as the manager of Van Halen were numbered. After all, has a way of catching up with you. Well, that's the end of Chapter 6. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 6 in the comments below. Before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon, Matt and Stacy from Canada. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.